Thanks a lot for your support. It's not always evident. No, that's great.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Take this. The water. Do I sit here? I'm Damien. I'm at the set up the session. I'm just working where you can sit. Okay, I'll sit here. Okay. You're in the middle. Okay. Okay. I think this is yours. It's a personal facility. I think this is yours.
Oh, okay, thank you very much.
Okay, and we need to have the air mics all the time, right?
Not all the time.
No?
If you feel comfortable with that, you can do it.
No, I don't.
Everyone can hear you through the microphone, that's how they're going to hear you. But you to hear the people when they're asking you questions, that's when you need
right,
to
right. Do they turn on the mic?
Your mic's on. So, because you're the moderator, I'm the moderator. You don't need to, like I said, you don't need to worry about time. We'll be keeping time for you, and we'll just let you know you'll get on the side. If there's any books or anything you need to do,
Well, yeah, they will be at the end.
feel free to table it, and maybe you want to enter closing remarks is to suggest people meet the author at the table here just behind the panel. Translation to French. I'll let people know, and are you ready to
I think my own movie.
Hello. So shall we start? I'm sorry for the small delays due to the end of the opening session of our MCM meeting. My name is Jorge Moreira da Silva. I'm the director of the Development Cooperation Directorate, and I think that you all know our guest, the author, Branko Milanovic, is currently a visiting University of New York Graduate Center and affiliated senior scholar at the Luxembourg Income Study. Today, we are glad to have a discussion on his book and his work on the relationship between globalization and income inequality. That's the central question that Branko poses in his book, The Global Inequality, a New Approach for the Age of Globalization. This book, which the economist hails as chipping away at tired economic orthodoxies, calls our attention to an intriguing paradox. And for those that are following, like me, the development cooperation, this paradox is really at the center. Even as income inequality has soared within many countries, notably the high-income ones, global income inequality has been falling particularly since 2000. So this book represents a marked departure from the traditional approach in its focus on global versus national inequality of incomes, and also more on income than on wealth. The book draws on decades of data to show that inequality moves in cycles, fueled by forces like conflict, technological disruption, access to social programs. But to quote, because I did my homework many months ago and I bought your book in Portuguese, quoting page 98 of the book, a very high inequality eventually becomes unsustainable, but it does not go down by itself. Rather, it generates processes like wars, social strife, and revolutions that lower it. Without further delay, and knowing that Branko is famous also for the elephant curve, I'm sure that we will ensure that no elephant will be left out of this discussion, and I welcome an open, honest, and informal discussion, and like to start by inviting Branko to present his findings, and then we will have a discussion. Branko, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jorge. I hope that everybody can hear me. I was actually here listening to Tyler Cohen like minutes ago, and I think these earplugs are really wonderful because there is so much noise around, but with the earplugs, it's between you and me, or Jorge. So I would very briefly sketch what the book is about. Although the book is not very long, which I think is maybe the advantage, because it's only 250 pages, it does actually deal with several topics. So in the first part, I will not go all the details, but I would just to give you an idea. In the first part, it really looks at what happened globally with global inequality over the last quarter century. And you know, it's something that obviously all of us are very much interested. And this is something that, as Jorge said before, was not really known until we had data from like 90% of the world. And we had the data from 90% of the world in terms of household surveys and incomes of people only starting with mid or late 1980s. And then these data were really not used until probably late 90s. Actually, my first paper on global income inequality was 1999. And I think it was actually the first paper which looked at inequality in the world as one. So technically, each individual counts the same in that study. So that was the first part, and that's where the elephant graph plays quite a big role. Actually, the book opens with the elephant graph. But then, you know, you have to realize that global inequality is composed of two different inequalities. One is inequality that we are all concerned with, and that's most of us actually talk about. That's inequality within countries. It's like within nation states. It's inequality within the US, France, Russia, China, India, Nigeria, you know, take any country in the world. So then I discuss that particular inequality because it's a very common inequality, and that's inequality on which most of the work has been done. You know, it goes back to, you know, obviously in a different way because they dealt with inequality between capital and labor, but it goes back to Ricardo. even to some extent to Adam Smith and obviously to Marx. And then we talk about, again, inequality between individual incomes, which goes back 100 years ago to Pareto. So I discussed that inequality, and I introduced something which actually Jorge alluded to, is the so-called Kuznets waves, which looks at changes, increases, and declines of inequality over a very long time. And I use quite a lot of work of other people who have done, economic historians, who have done work in mostly medieval Europe, and they actually see these periods are basically waves of rising inequality and declining inequality. Now, for the modern era, I think actually we have the original workhorse of our work until very recently was the Kuznets cycle, which actually said that the country as it develops starts by being essentially more equal. This is questionable, but the idea was essentially based on the US experience where you have lots of small holders, and then inequality among them is relatively, they're mostly equal. And then the country develops, and then people move to the industrial sector and to move to the cities, and there is greater heterogeneity of employment in the cities, so inequality goes up. And then in that view that Kuznets propounded is actually late 50s and early 1960s, inequality then would go down because capital incomes would become less important, because more people would get educated, so the premium to education would go down, and because social policies of the state would become more important. So that theory really worked very well until the 1980s. The problem was in the rich countries from 1980s, all of them had an increase in inequality. So then the issue becomes, how do you interpret that? And there may be different ways. For example, in the case of Piketty, although it was not said always very explicitly, but the idea was that generally speaking, capitalism generates a very high level of inequality, and there was a very exceptional period between, let's suppose, end of the World War I and 1980, where inequality went down in many rich countries. So it's a little bit like exceptionalism of that period, and then we are going back to a general sort of pattern under capitalism of very high inequality. A different way, which I actually explain in the book, is to see that current wave of inequality is driven by technological change, which was similar to what happened during the first industrial revolution in the early 19th century, and by globalization. So I discussed that more, and I will stop here because I already spent too much time on that chapter, which is very important, but it's also one component of global inequality. Now, what is the second component of global inequality? It is inequality between the countries. Now, what does it mean? It means inequality in mean incomes, average incomes between the countries. Again, that's inequality that we intuitively know well. That's inequality between Morocco and France, or Morocco and Spain. It's inequality between Mexico and the United States. It's inequality between Indonesia and Malaysia. I'm just giving you the examples of countries that are close together, but will have large differences in income. Now, that inequality you calculate obviously across 200 countries in the world, and that inequality is the second and actually more important component of overall global inequality. So just to summarize, and that's actually what I deal in chapter 3. So just to summarize, if you have total global inequality as a number, X, 2/3 of that X are due to inequalities between nations, and 1/3 to inequalities within nations. So when we talk about inequalities in the rich countries in general, we have to realize that we are talking about inequalities among the top of the global income distribution. If you take Western Europe, most of the even poor people in Western Europe are at something like 70th percentile of the world income distribution. So basically, West European income distributions start at the 70th percentile and run all the way to the 100th percentile. So we are talking, like in the OECD, we are really talking about inequality within the top group of the world. But, of course, lots of inequality in the world is due to differences in mean incomes between poor countries and rich countries. Now, just the last point on that. Actually, two last points. One, as you can already see, these inequalities would feed migration, and that's an important part of the book. Migration, because it really sort of follows from large differences in mean income. Why does it follow from that? because large difference in mean income simply means that if you're born in a poor country, you can actually multiply your income by 5 or 10 just by migrating to a rich country. The second thing is to realize that high growth rates of China and India, and generally speaking Asia, is sort of shrinking that between component, because these countries are becoming closer in terms of their average income to the West, to the advanced economies, and that component is shrinking. But the rising inequalities in China, US, Europe, and elsewhere are widening the within component. So you have a very peculiar development. Let me just get some water. A peculiar development in the world where you have shrinkage of the between component, which is the largest component of total inequality, and the widening of the within component. Now, in the last, and I'll stop on that, in the last 25 years, the situation was such that actually the shrinkage was more important than the widening. And that explains the decline of global inequality. Last caveat on that, what can we say about the global top 1%? It is indeed a problem because, generally speaking, the surveys do not really cover very well the top 1%. So if you make some adjustments for the under-coverage or under-reporting of the top 1%, that decline becomes much smaller. And you can even say the decline becomes possibly statistically non-significant. So we have to be careful. We have to say that based on the data that we have, there is a decline in global inequality driven by the emerging, or as Angus Madison, who actually did most of his career here in OECD, called it the resurgent Asia. But at the same time, there is a general increase in the top 1% in all these countries and globally, which actually is, as I said before, underrepresented in surveys, and if we were to include it more accurately, might actually overturn that decline in global inequality. But nevertheless, the bottom line is that we are now witnessing a process which is characterized by 3 developments. First, rising inequalities within nation states, diminishing differences between Asia and Europe, which are actually also meaning diminishing differences in income, generally speaking, in the world, and consequently, the decline in global inequality combined with the rise of plutocracy. So there are lots of rises and declines, so the story is not as simple as it might seem at first, that we are just having an increase everywhere. We have increases in inequalities, but we have other inequalities that are going down. So it's, as I said, in that sense, it's a more complex story that the book actually presents.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Branko. I would like to open the floor, but before I heard you yesterday in a panel with Gabriela Ramos, our Sherpa and Chief of Staff, when we were presenting our report on inclusive growth, where you mentioned the particular case of Africa, and you didn't seem so optimistic about the menu of policies to address inequality in Africa. Can you focus or at least address this point?
Well, I'm glad that you asked that, because I do actually omit Africa, because oftentimes I make very sort of short presentation like today's, and the presentation is dominated by what has happened in China, and then in India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and so on. And of course, people focus on China versus the US or China versus Western Europe. And we all forget Africa, which didn't play a huge role so far. But what is important to realize there is these hopeful developments, which are illustrated by the success of Asia, have not been replicated in Africa. Now, this is a problem for global poverty, but it's also a problem for global inequality. And let me just explain very briefly why it is a problem. because Africa is a continent that so far has really failed to converge. And I'm, of course, grossly simplifying, but you know, it is a simplification which is not unreasonable, that actually you have 55 countries in Africa, and when you look at the ratio of their income today with income in Western European countries, and compare 1960s to today, it has practically gone down everywhere. So Africa, actually in some countries, I think actually I did work some 10 years ago, you had like a dozen of countries with a per capita income which is below the income level at independence. So it has not converged. Now, as population in Africa is becoming larger and larger, Africa would actually represent much greater sort of share of the global population and would affect global inequality much more. On the other hand, the fact that China is now becoming relatively rich and would in 25 years reach the average level of the European Union means that China's contribution towards reducing global inequality is disappearing. Actually, it is sort of fading. So you have then a very interesting situation that unless Africa really catches up and becomes the Asia of the 21st century, we might actually have a reversal where actually global inequality starts going up. And this is particularly important, I think, because one has to realize that global inequality, or actually general inequality, can go down by three forces. Either you reduce inequality in your own countries, which of course should contribute to reduction of global inequality, or your countries catch up with the rich world, which for example is the case of India, China, and so forth, or you have migration. Because migration is simply the same thing as growth in your own country. You just become rich in country A, or you become richer in country B. But politically, migration has entirely different consequences and aspects than growth of the country itself, poor country itself. So in that sense, I think actually what is happening in Africa in the future would very much determine not only calculation of global inequality, but would also determine what happens with migration from Africa into Europe.
Thank you very much. So let's open the floor for quick questions. So it's good that we maximize the number of questions. I have one question here. Don't know if you have a micro. I think it's coming.
Thank you very much for your precision on your book. I have a question regarding the works that have been published in 2017 by Thomas Piketty and the other 100 researchers around the world that have been working on global inequality and distribution of income. I'd like to have your thoughts on the methods that they've used with trying to rescale to national accounts and using fiscal data to have a better picture of the global 1% and what that actually means for the distribution of income.
Well, it's so very good that you asked the question. First, I was here in December, actually, when they introduced the report. I was one of the commentators. And I was last week in Paris when we had a very big session precisely on the topic. So it's a huge topic. One has to realize that actually, as you mentioned, we have three sources of data. Historically, household surveys have been really used a lot. Fiscal data, Piketty has gone back to actually what Kuznets has been using in the 50s and reintroduced fiscal data. And then we have administrative data. The issue, which are really data which practically exist in a few Nordic countries, where all the transactions or incomes are being reported electronically, as it were. The problem of, you know, if you look at, for example, the work that was done by Thomas Piketty, then Lucas Chancel, Facundo Alvaredo, Emmanuel Saez, in the report, fiscal data, I think, are very good for rich countries because they include the bulk of the population. They don't include everybody. In the US, they leave out about 8% of the population. The problem is that fiscal data, when you move them to the less developed parts of the world, don't include many people. You know, it might come as a surprise to you that the Chinese data include 0.5% of the population. So these are the people who actually report, I mean, they pay taxes and they are subject to taxation and you have information. Now, what do you do for 99.5% of the people? You still rely on household surveys. So there is I mean, for India, we have now reached the situation that it used to be less than 2% of the fiscal what they call it, contribuable, but now it has been 7%. So it's an improvement, but we are still leaving out 93% of the population. So essentially, when you move to the world as a whole, you still have to rely almost entirely on household survey data, which then should be complemented with fiscal data at the top. And that was the point of the conference that we had here. So I don't want to go into all the methodological issues, but I think really that it's very important that these two really big sources of data, fiscal and household surveys, be sort of put together, and that we should come up to some conclusion, some idea of how it should be done.
Thank you. I think that we have one question here, the other there, Ida.
I think the mic is not, is the mic working? My mic, and then let's, yeah. Yeah.
And I can stand here.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I just, is it working like this?
It is working
Yeah.
fine,
All right.
yeah.
So I just wanted to come back actually to the countries left behind and the looking forward to the kind of, you talk about possibly a blip in the decline of global inequality, and notably Africa, and you mentioned a bit Central America also as a region, and the fact that you really say that we still need economic growth in these countries. This year I work for in George's Directorate, we're focusing our main report on development cooperation on actually how development cooperation can address leaving no one behind. And so kind of a question, there's some tensions because some people say, well, aid can actually solve some of the migration problems. It's very hard to show how aid also contributes to economic growth. President Macron just spoke about development being a very big priority. He talks about health and education. So a more parochial question for you is, what can ODA do? It's $146 billion to really help those countries that are left behind. What would you even take a risk in prioritizing doing in that space? Thank you.
Well, that's also an excellent question to which I really don't have a very good answer. You know, I've spent my practically whole life working on inequality. But when you come to the global level, you realize the importance of economic growth. I'm not saying that's the only time that you do, but you know, one cannot just, as you implied, actually, I mean, as I agree with you, one cannot just think about solution of inequality within national borders. It's really growth is crucial. Now, the question is, what can aid do for growth? And as you know, empirical studies of aid and growth, they're done for the, you know, and it's actually very often misleading to call it aid, by the way, because it is really very often loans. You know, I become a little bit allergic to the term aid because you have in the newspapers the country is not able to return aid. Well, if it was aid, then it should not be returning anything. You know, it was loans. But there is an aid component, obviously, in some of these loans. And also for the World Bank and the IMF, the results are inconclusive. So I am in favor of aid, but I must say that I have become somewhat skeptical about the ability of aid itself to promote development, particularly in Africa or elsewhere. So it has really, obviously, it has to be done domestically. And I've become, I have to say that, it's not in the book, but it's on my web and actually on my blogs, which you're very welcome to read. I've become a very strong proponent of the Chinese approach to Africa, because I believe that actually by doing infrastructural investments, you're really enabling people to actually connect much better, to bring goods to the market, to actually create a market which didn't exist, like a single market rather than, you know, a small divided markets. But to cut the story short, I believe, yes, aid is important. I think it should be raised. President Macron mentioned today, I was listening to his speech, 0.55%, which is, I don't know, probably France was at 0.5 or something, so which is an improvement. 45. But you know, we know that 50 years ago, the objective was put at 0.7%. So we are now saying, well, this is phenomenal that we are getting to 0.55, but something that we should have done half a century ago. So, you know, as I said, there should be greater aid, but I don't think that aid alone is going to solve the problem.
Also because what we are missing is the trillions, not the billions, and aid cannot do it
That's true.
alone.
We're missing trillions.
So we have two questions in the middle, please.
So thank you, Professor Milanovic. I was just to put in a stress on you worked a lot on income data. What about wealth data? As you know, and as Mr. Piketty stressed out, wealth is a very important component on inequalities and socio-economic inequalities. Do you think that developing countries must put a stress on this, as the European Union is doing with the FHCS, yes, the wealth survey at the European level?
I totally agree. I think actually wealth is, first, wealth is very important per se, and wealth distribution is extremely important. I have not worked on it. I believe it's, as I said, crucially important. For example, there is, of course, Piketty's work was absolutely, you know, how should I say, a game changer in that area. There is a recent book by Ed Wolfe on essentially wealth of in America, where you actually, of course, find, there was some allusion to that also in the OECD report, you find essentially 10% of the people in most rich countries having between 70 and 90% of financial assets. So basically, to simplify, you know, 10% own the financial assets of the rich countries. It's extremely concentrated distribution. So I think much more work needs to be done on that. It's also the work which has to be linked with the other work on, which was mentioned today also by President Macron, but it was also yesterday, by tax havens and ability of the rich people to actually keep lots of their wealth outside and not to be taxed. So I think that it's more difficult actually to get the data.
Can you hear me? No.
And ECB and European, as you know, your ECB wealth survey has actually been something relatively new. And I think we would actually do much, I mean, great improvements in the future in wealth data collection. So I think it's really a venue for progress. I would actually suggest to people who are young, who think about writing dissertations on that, that's actually an area that is really very good to do work on.
Hi, how are you? So when it comes to fighting inequality, many people talk about investing in health, in education for those, you know, who have been left behind. Like, I come from a region, Latin America, where countries historically have invested lots of money in education and healthcare system, in social programs also. So, like, I mean, we still remain to be like the region with the highest levels of inequality in the world, although like poverty levels in general have come down, but still it looks like we're not sort of like getting there. We're not solving the problem. Still, we're going to be the region that's going to grow, you know, the least within the next few years. So, I mean, what have we done wrong in general? But like, what sort of like hopes we have in the future?
Let me try to answer this indirectly, and I will come to Latin America then towards the end. In the book, there are really two areas where actually I discuss policy. One is that I mentioned migration. I don't have the time here to discuss what is my proposal for migration. It's very controversial. Many people don't like it because it includes somewhat discriminatory status of the migrants. But anyway, you will find it in chapter 3. Now, I also discuss social policies in the rich countries, which has some bearing to Latin America. And there, I'm of the view that the social policies which were done in the rich world and which have really brought inequality down from 1945 to 1980 are not policies that can be replicated in the future. And by that I mean that, for example, the components of that, which were large trade unionization, trade union density, are not going to be present simply because trade union density has declined everywhere. And it continues to decline because of the very changed nature of jobs, as you know. Then, secondly, education premium, which has been brought down, is now going up again, and you're also facing the ceiling in terms of the number of years of education that you can have. And then, finally, tax and transfer policies have reached also the limit, partly because of taxation. You cannot have really marginal tax rates of 90% now, as you had in the 1960s, when you had really closed capital accounts, practically. So I think that we should, and that's the answer to your question very briefly, I think that we should have a sort of a philosophical change, which is to some extent present in many of the proposals. And that philosophical change is to work on equalization of endowments in labor and capital across people. So that means that, of course, all policies which would reduce inequality in education, which would improve access to education for the poor people, and, for example, also access to education, better education outcomes for very young people that we know actually that really depends on what happens when you're very young. They are all, I think, very good policies. Likewise, policies that would reduce concentration of capital income are very important. So really there should be two parts. One on labor, and actually what is called human capital. Another one is on financial capital and capital in general. And then we could also entertain the possibility that the size of the welfare state, which I think has reached its limit, would not rise any further, because if you have lots of equal endowments, you don't need to redistribute current income to the extent that you're redistributing it now. So that would be the philosophical change. Now, to answer very briefly a question on Latin America, on which I don't know that much, is Latin America, as you know, has had large declines in poverty, even large declines in inequality, although some of that is contested because of the, as you were asking me, the fiscal data. But it really faces different issues, and that's why Latin America has produced one of the, maybe the first, sort of technological innovation in the area of social transfers, which doesn't come from the rich world. And this is unconditional cash transfers. And I think that's actually very well reflected the conditions in Latin America. And as you know, now it's actually being applied in quite a few other countries. For example, it's applied in Armenia, it's applied in Georgia, it's applied in Ethiopia and African countries, and even in India. So, we actually have, there is a sort of innovation that comes from Latin America.
Okay, we have two more questions. One there, and then in the first row.
My name is Svetlana Petrakova. Mr. Milanovic, thank you very much for your presentation. My question is, how to convince wealthy people from one country to help poor people from another country? Why should they do that? Thank you.
Well, that's an excellent question. I'm actually not sort of pending my arguments on that assumption. I don't think that wealthy people in France are going to really sort of fight in order to send more money to poor people in Senegal. I actually think that very often wealthy people in France don't even want to share the money with poor people in France. So I think this is a problem. It can be dealt, the problem of redistribution within nation states can be dealt obviously by parliaments and by governments of such states. But we don't have a global government, so when it comes to redistribution globally, I don't think that much of that can be expected in the future. I'm all in favor of cosmopolitan attitude and philosophy, but when you translate it in the political realm, as I was saying in the question about aid, we have to be realistic. This is going to be an important component, but we should not be unrealistic in believing that suddenly people from rich countries are going to really spend lots of money for the poor countries, nor should we be unrealistic in expecting that that amount of money alone, as you were saying, we're talking about billions there, and we need trillions. That is not going to make a difference. No, I actually, as I was saying before, my whole sort of approach is not dependent on believing that rich people from rich countries are going to actually willingly support poor people in poor countries. I mentioned that again. That's something that needs to be done. How rich people from one country would actually help rich people from the same country is something that is done, obviously, by parliaments and governments. That's within the nation state. But globally, obviously, we don't have anything like that.
May I have a follow-up question before giving the floor to the last question? Don't you think that the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Agenda, the 2030 Agenda, may be an ingredient or an element to promote the decline of inequality, because the MDGs were very much focused on poverty eradication. The SDGs are more focused on sustainable development. Do you consider that this framework of sustainable development is more pro inequality decline than the previous framework? Because maybe this question is also related to the question that was tabled.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I'm actually in favor of having inequality as one of the objectives of the goals in SDGs. But this is a goal, you know, the translation of that goal in reality, real money, I think it takes, as you know, a long time. And even when you look at aid, and it has not really risen over the last decade. So to some extent, understandably, because many of the rich countries have not grown. And they were not actually increasing aid. So yes, I think, yes, it is a good development, but I don't think that actually that's something per se which would make a difference. Let me just put it like that. We have reached the objectives of reducing global poverty. Well, it used to be like 1/3 of the world, 40% even of the world population, now it's under 10%. But until the year 2000, 98% of the decline on global poverty was due to whom? One country. Well, I don't need to mention that country, it's obvious, it's China. So it's China alone that drove global poverty down. So if we now say, well, look, we have done so well because we had this goal, in reality, we had this goal, but China reduced global poverty because it followed policy and brought out like 700 or whatever million people out of poverty. So I think actually the responsibility for all the things ultimately is at the level of nation state.
Thank you. I will have one final question related to the point on democracy and the political systems.
And I will be brief in my answers.
But before that, please.
Okay. Two parts perhaps to the question. First of all, how can we really best or practically create that kind of equalization of capital you're talking about? And second to that, even if we achieve that, there's also much inequality in the returns to capital. So is it even enough to create that equalization of capital?
Yeah, well, that's a long question. The answer how we can achieve it is not an easy one. I'll give you like 3 proposals that I have. One of that is much more favorable tax policy towards small investors, because we know that actually large investors have now, of course, much more favorable policies because they're able to create lobbies that actually make tax rates that they pay very low. You know, we have seen that in the US elections, and it's not an oddity, that Romney paid 12% tax rate, Trump paid 0%. And actually, since I became a US green card holder, I've asked my accountant in Washington, how is this happening? He says, well, that's obvious. No one who is rich in this town pays a tax rate which is higher than 5%. Because they all have different ways of getting rid of taxes. So what Trump did was not illegal. He was actually using the tax code which was set by the rich people. And that means that, of course, the middle class pays tax rates on average. I'm talking average tax rates of 35 or 40%, and in Western Europe, probably 5 percentage points more. So that would be one change. Another one would be employee stock ownership plans, which have been tried, and where actually you have worker ownership much more represented than in the past. A third one would be the idea that was Atkinson's last book, which was the capital grants, which would be given to people at 18 or 21 years of age. All of these things, with taxation of inheritance, would actually reduce concentration of capital incomes. And for the fact that higher returns are received by people with more capital, I think lots of that comes from the fact that I was just mentioned about tax policies. And the other one comes, and that was very nicely done in Ed Wolf's book, is from the composition of assets. The rich people have more volatile assets, but on average these assets, as you know, give you higher return. So the composition of assets inherently favors the rich. And that's a problem that is very difficult to deal with.
Well, thank you. And I have one final question before going to the book signing, and it's about the role of the political systems. We are here and not at Roland Garros because we think that inequality is a priority and must be a priority both at the international system and at the national policies. Do you think that it is possible to address inequality as a major challenge, both at the national and international level, without a reform on the political systems, because we tend to see the technology and industry 4.0, but sometimes we see the politics and political systems still on the 1.0. Do you think that the role of political systems is a relevant one for this discussion?
I think it's extremely relevant. I think ultimately it is really the policies which would determine whether we really face up to the challenge of higher inequality. Again, simply because he spoke, I mean, just this afternoon, but I think actually what Macron mentioned, it was financialization and digitalization. And these are indeed two very strong forces that have pushed plus globalization, that have pushed inequality up. And on the other hand, there was a policy that I just mentioned, that the rich people were not paying taxes, and the rich companies, as he was talking today, and people are right a lot, are not paying taxes. And it's really an anomaly. It's an anomaly that people and companies that are benefiting the most from this globalization 4.0, whatever, are the people who actually tried massively to avoid taxes. So we need definitely to make political change. How that would happen, I think it's difficult to say. But for example, I think for the US, it seems to me fairly obvious that a major change in the financing of the political system is necessary. When I hear the politicians, and there I have Hillary Clinton in mind, claiming that the fact that she speaks in favor of, speaks in front of Goldman Sachs and gets paid thousands of dollars for like one talk like this, does not affect our policy. But then we have to believe that these people who are paying for that are really crazy, because these people have made their money by actually fighting on each and every dollar over 50 years, and then suddenly they say, okay, it's November of such and such year, I'm going to give $500,000 to a politician and not ask anything in return. It is absolutely crazy. It's like when I go to a restaurant and say, oh, I'm going to pay you, €100 for the dinner, but I'm not going to eat anything. It's really, there is a quid pro quo. If you give money, you get legislation from that. And I'm taking the US as an example, but the situation, for example, as you know, in Europe, we have massive scandals, and they're always related to the financing of elections. In Eastern Europe, you have parties that basically have legally no money received, but of course everybody knows that they're actually plutocrats and oligarchs who are funding them. And in other countries, you have the situations where basically you have kleptocratic governments. So this is, I think, key policy or political change that needs to be done. Now, who is going to do it? Well, I have to ask you that.
Well, thank you very much. I knew that I should take this question at the end, because if I would have taken at the beginning, maybe the discussion will be too much focus on that. I think that we should give a round of applause to Branko Milanovic.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks so much. I think it was a very good decision.
Thank you. Thank you. And let's go for the book signing. Thank you.
Yeah, there will be a book signing over there, because it would become all political discussion. That's not the part.